So, at every level of society today, politics, religion, race, age, gender, sexuality, class, we are met with division and distrust. We live in a society governed by an ethic of domination. And since that first European stepped foot on this hemisphere, through the genocide of the native peoples, the enslavement of Africans, extinction of animals, decimation of our forests, destruction of our atmosphere, that ethic pervades every level of our society, from highest level of the government to business, to our entertainment, and to family life. Domination is the foundation of our society. It's recognized in the strict hierarchies that we follow. And it's all based largely on theologies and philosophies of domination that are as nearly as old as civilization. It is not the fault of a particular religion, race, gender, or class. It's not the rich's fault. It's not men's fault. It's not the white people's fault, Europeans' fault. It's not Christians' fault. It's all older than that. But we inherit that system. We live in it. And whether we are born into a dominator class or a dominated class, we didn't choose it. I didn't choose to be a white male in this society. And so what we commonly call white guilt serves nothing but the status quo and is a waste of our time and energy. Beating ourselves up for things that we did not create doesn't do anything but keep us where we're at. We did not start this fire. Cue Billy Joel. No, never mind. We didn't start this fire, but I do believe there are real things we can do as individuals, as a church, as a denomination to slow its spread. So from this to this, when the Nazis, the Klan, the collection of other groups that fully embody that dominator ethic gathered in Charlottesville, Virginia last month, fully armed and prepared for violent action, they met virtually no legal constraints. According to several sources, even though they broke several provisions of their permit, the police made no real effort to shut them down. The torch-lit procession that preceded the planned rally, it was not permitted and clearly indicated a violent intent with chants like, "You will not replace us," and "blood and soil," with clear ties to Nazi Germany. They were armed, ready for a fight. I don't want to dwell on the events of the weekend. There's no shortage of coverage on the news, social media. But I do want to make sure the point that this was no mere rally. As Zenobia Jeffries points out in her article in Yes Magazine, who wears paramilitary gear and carries automatic weapons to a rally? Who takes shields and helmets and pepper spray and bats and sticks to a rally? The car didn't crash. It was driving at full speed into a crowd of counter-protesters. She points out what happened in Charlottesville was white nationalist extremists inciting a riot. This is not a free speech issue. And the media has made much to do about the so-called Antifa or anti-fascist at times making them out to be the moral equivalent of the alt-right by calling them the alt-left. Oh, see, well, they both are at fault, right? And that's what we're told by our political leaders as well. The fault was equal on both sides. Of course, this version of events misses the point that the anti-fascists don't hold rallies. They don't march in an attempt to intimidate innocent bystanders. They exist to serve as a counter to the alt-right. I don't necessarily condone their tactics, but many of the peaceful protesters in Charlottesville credit the Antifa for saving them from the clear and present danger of the alt-right. In her account of the events of the day, Brandy Daniels, a postdoc fellow at UVA, said this, on Democracy Now!, Cornel West, who was also in the line with us, said that he felt the Antifa saved his life. She says, I didn't roll my eyes at that statement or see it as an exaggeration. I saw it as a very reasonable hypothesis based on the facts we had. The Reverend Seth Wispelway said he believed the death toll would have been significantly higher had the Antifa not been present, making the point, they have their tools and they are not one I will personally use, but our purposes were the same, block this violent tide. The media thrives on an us versus them narrative. Left versus right, alt-left versus alt-right, Democrat versus Republican, white versus black, etc., etc. It's critical that we do not accept this narrative. We do not live in either or world or an either or society, but that is what we are told over and over, us versus them. The truth of the matter is, we do not live in 1930s era Germany. And there is a real and serious opposition to the emboldened right-wing extremists. It's true, we cannot ignore this threat. We cannot just say, oh, they're just boys being boys, right? But let us also not pretend that it is more than it is. In Boston, the so-called free speech rally of the week following Charlottesville, tens of thousands of counter-protesters took to the streets to drown out the rally, which, according to an article in the Washington Post, by 1 p.m., the handful of rally attendees had left the Boston Common Pavilion, concluding the event without planned speeches. Yes, certain groups have been emboldened by a president that seems to support their cause. But it is abundantly clear that the people of this country just will not tolerate their intolerance. We will not. We have a reason to be afraid of people who want to incite violence. But let us not be cowed in fear and stop doing what we need to do to bring peace, joy, and love to this world. Let it not slow us down from seeking justice because of what some radicals, how they might react. So let's slow down. Let's not overdo. Because the truth of the matter is that we are all lost. We are all trying to make sense of this society, a society that is very efficient at meeting our physical needs, but has long ago ceased to meet our deeper psycho-spiritual needs of belonging, meaning, and purpose. That's all of us. All of them and all of them in Boston. We're all trying to make sense of this. We're all in it together. And as Thomas Merton points out, we never see the one truth that would help us begin to solve our ethical and political problems. That we are all more or less wrong, that we are all at fault, all limited and obstructed by our mixed motives, our self-deception, our greed, our self-righteousness, and our tendency to aggression and hypocrisy. This is true for all of us. It's true for those young men caught up in the delusion of their white supremacy, or their male supremacy, or their Christian supremacy. We're all screwed up. So what do we do about it, though? What do we do? Our whole society is so screwed up. We're pointing fingers, calling them names. What can we do to rebuild the connections, to tear down the walls that separate us? Well, this past year, I've started driving for Uber and Lyft. Apps that allow people to get on the app and request a ride, and then a ride shows up. Sometimes I'm that ride. And I must say that it was not all I expected it to be. Before I started, I imagined I would be driving tourists around town to the beach, etc. And that's a little bit part of it, but most of what I do is I drive people to their minimum wage job because they can't afford a car. I drive people to appointments because they don't have a friend or somebody in their life that could give them a ride. The reality of driving Uber is that most of the people that get into my car are struggling in one way or another to make ends meet. And they are black and they're white, they're Hispanic, they are both rich and poor, some with too much on their mind to dabble in small talk, others so desperate for human connection, I might think that the only reason they're using Uber is for the opportunity to talk with another person. My passengers shop at Walmart, the outlet malls, and the most expensive stores downtown. Some of my passengers are clearly grateful for the ride. Others seem almost embarrassed to be in my little Ford Focus. And except for the one couple that I call the Bickersons, who were clearly under the influence of one or more substances, I treat all my passengers with the same care and respect due them. And as for the Bickersons, I did try to treat them respectfully, and I respectfully asked them to leave my car. And that was because a matter of self-respect and self-care. Now, generally speaking, I try not to get into the details about my other job, this job, when I'm driving Uber, in large part because, in my experience, people tend to make assumptions about me once they find out I'm a minister. It's not that I lie, but I'm not always forthcoming. See, minister is not my identity. It's my job, so I can just leave it out. I guess the flip side of that is the assumption some people make about me when I'm driving for Uber. I try to keep this in mind when I pick someone up. Because just as I'm not defined by this job or that job, by my gender, age, whatever, neither is anybody else. I'm not defined by the car I drive, my color of my skin. We are defined, all of us, by the choices we make every single day, especially those little choices. It's true of all of us. Aristotle said, excellence is an art won by training and habituation. We do not act rightly because we have virtue or excellence, but rather we have those because we have acted rightly. We are what we repeatedly do. Excellence, virtue, is not an act, but a habit. Virtue is not the reason that we do right. Virtue is what we have when we make a habit of doing the right thing. And here's the thing I realized while driving around this town, picking up strangers and dropping them off. Very often in isolation, sometimes in the dark, I realized that the vast majority of people are decent, virtuous people. The vast majority of people are decent. And they're not out to harm each other, harm us. They're just trying to make their way through this difficult life. Some of them without much help, much support, without much family or community. I can do what I do out there because people are basically decent people, are basically decent. And that's true for the vast majority of the world. Imagine if Islam was truly a religion that preached hatred and violence. Imagine if all 1.5 billion Muslims were the terrorists that the news and our governments want us to believe they are. It's the smallest fraction that take violence as a means of virtue. The smallest fraction resort to violence. The vast majority, the billions of human beings, are not violent. They're good, honest, hardworking people. When I'm driving Uber, there is no segregation by race or income or religion. It has helped me break free of the bubble that I have lived in for some time. This bubble, this largely segregated bubble of Unitarian Universalism. We didn't choose to be segregated, but here we are. And we can't beat ourselves up for this. Wring our hands in concern. Instead, we can start making different choices. Different choices that will result in a different future. A new outcome going forward. Because virtue and excellence is the habit of doing the right thing. So what are those choices? What do we need to do? This is what I wrestle with all the time. How do we create a religion that potentially speaks to any one of those people that get into my car? Any one of them. Regardless of their income, their age, their education. How do we speak to a religious movement? How do we create a religious movement that speaks to everybody equally? Or potentially speaks to anyone? A A religion that the homeless people that many of us will be feeding tonight would feel both welcomed and hear what they need to hear. Not this, intellectual diatribe that I usually spout. But a real promise of hope, a promise of love, a promise that things will get better. How do we hope to make such a monumental shift? A religion that not only rejects an ethic of domination that is the legacy of history, but offers a real and significant alternative. Author Sharon Welch, in her book, A Feminist Ethic of Risk, which was required reading on my path to ministry, but for too long has been stuck on my shelf, unread and unheeded. Welch writes, as we resist the evil of racism, seeing its connections with other forms of structural oppression, we need to learn that failure to develop the strength to remain angry in order to continually love and therefore resist is to die. The death we face is not immediate as that faced by many African Americans. The Euro-American who gives up the struggle against war, against racism, does not face physical death. But the death that is experienced by those who turn from rage, who forego resistance, is nonetheless real. It is the death of the imagination, the death of caring, the death of the ability to love. And her solution is what she calls an ethic of risk, which is characterized by three elements, each of which is essential: a redefinition of responsible action, grounding in community, and a strategic risk-taking. She notes that the responsible action does not mean the certain achievement of desired ends, but the creation of a matrix in which further actions are possible, the creation of the conditions of possibility for desired changes. Thus, an ethic of risk, a fancy term for faith, as far as I'm concerned. I think one of the hardest, and the reasons most of us, myself included, have such a hard time explaining Unitarian Universalism to people outside our walls is because we do not explicitly stand for anything. We have a nice set of principles, but they are purposely vague. They're vague enough to not trigger concern for those uncomfortable with explicitly religious language. But in that vagueness, they are not explicit enough to draw people who are in search, or people in dire need of explicit meaning and purpose in their life. I envision a spiritual movement that embodies our Unitarian Universalist principles and values and encourages its members to do the same. Imagine a movement that doesn't merely imply or encourage an active resistance to violence and hatred, but makes it a way of life. Empowers us to do that. A movement that actively works to create the matrix from which a better future can be formed. A fully integrated community inclusive of all differences. Those that follow an ethic of domination to exploit to their advantage. To tear down the walls that others want us to have between us. A movement not afraid to make demands of its members. A movement that holds itself and all its members accountable to its central tenets. An ethic of domination tells us we must know what this movement will look like, how it will be structured, what will be the tenets, etc., before we can begin to form it. But an ethic of risk invites us to move in the direction of our dreams, developing the matrix of success as we go. Is this not how the universe itself came into being? Is this not how life emerged on this planet? How evolution works? Every step of the way, the universe created the conditions out of which the next evolution of itself would emerge. There was no master plans, no guarantees of success, merely a matrix of possibility, that which is the source of imagination and love, that which is called divinity, the great mystery, goddess and God, that which we live in, though so often we refuse to see and to feel, to taste, to know. Most of us are familiar with this now famous quote by Martin Niemöller. He said that, writing after the war in Germany, he wrote that first they came for the communists, and I didn't speak out because I wasn't a communist. Then they came for the trade unionists, and I didn't speak out because I wasn't a trade unionist. They came for the Jews, I didn't speak out because I wasn't a Jew. And then they came for me, and there was no one left to speak out for me. As long as we continue to uphold all these distinctions, all the ones that we have now, black, white, rich, poor, Christian, Muslim, Unitarian, Universalist, as long as we maintain these distinctions, even if we don't like them, we all, through our decisions, our actions on a day-to-day basis, so often what we do, unaware, not because we want to, but because that's the way the system is, we continue to support this system. And as long as we accept the narrative that allows the ethic of dominance to divide us, it has the potential to tear us down. So let us instead build a movement that does not deny our differences, but celebrates them, while upholding the great truth of interdependence, the divine unity, the matrix of creation from which we are all a part. Let us build a movement that's like Uber, as welcoming as Uber, providing a space that helps us reach our destination, a space for anybody. So that when they come for any one of us, they come for all of us. There are lots of little things we can do in the short term to improve the situation in this country, in this world. And they need to be done. But at the same time, we need to have a vision in place for the long term. How are we going to heal the divisions, tear down the walls that separate us, and create a new society? Where does that begin? What does that look like? These are big questions. But it begins here, it begins now, with the choice of what we do right after this service, when we leave this service, by the choices we make in the upcoming stewardship campaign, choices we make on how we participate in this community and the wider community. The potential of Unitarian Universalism is so great that we have barely begun to scratch the surface here and in the world. Where it goes next is up to you. Let's build the society that those that would hate would just know that their message is not welcomed. And so that they are no longer emboldened to say it, to speak it, to take it to the streets. If they want to hate in the privacy of the home, that's their right. But we build the society today that keeps them there. And maybe, just maybe, in the building of that society, we create the space that maybe they don't feel so isolated and alone, and that hate never builds in them. I may say I'm a dreamer, but I'm not the only one. So be it. Amen. Blessed be.